Photographing Christ the Redeemer was supposed to be just another job. But Robert Calloway never came home. In 1995, a renowned American photographer received an offer he couldn't refuse to capture never-before-seen images of Christ the Redeemer. The payment was made in advance, but no one ever found out who actually hired him. Before going up, he heard strange stories: guards who abandoned their posts without explanation, figures that appeared inside the statue, people who went up and never came down. The next day, Robert entered Christ accompanied by a guide. He never came out. Days later, they found his camera. Only a single photo had been recorded, and after you hear it, you'll never see Christ the Redeemer the same way again. Robert Calloway adjusted his glasses on his nose as he read the email for the third time. Something seemed wrong. A newly launched newspaper in the United States, the American Observer, wanted him to capture exclusive images of Christ the Redeemer in Rio de Janeiro. There was no detailed brief, just a clear request. We need something unique. Go up where no one else has been. The strangest thing? The payment was already in the account, in advance. Robert wasn't the type of man to refuse opportunities. At 38, he had already photographed some of the world's most iconic places, from the Grand Canyon to the top of the Empire State Building. His work was recognized, but this proposal out of nowhere bothered him. Who would pay in advance without even negotiating? Even suspicious, Robert packed his bags and left Chicago, Illinois, his hometown. The biting cold of the United States contrasted with the images he saw in Rio's tourist guides: sunny beaches, Sugarloaf Mountain, and of course, the colossal Christ with open arms. As the plane crossed the Atlantic, he decided to push the doubts aside. It was just another job. Upon landing at Galeon Airport, the humid heat of Rio enveloped him like a suffocating hug. The sound of loud voices, horns, and announcements in Portuguese made the city pulse with life. A man with a badge waited for him at the exit, holding a paper that read, "Calloway. Welcome to Brazil, sir. My name is Miguel. I'll be your guide to Christ the Redeemer. Your hotel is already booked. We'll start early tomorrow." Robert nodded, but something in the guide's tone of voice seemed hesitant, as if he wanted to say something else, but preferred not to. That night, before going to sleep, Robert decided to go out alone in Rio. He walked through the streets of Copacabana, talked to locals, and between one beer and another, heard something that made his stomach churn. "Are you going up Christ?" asked a waiter when he saw his camera. "Yes, tomorrow morning. Work." The man exchanged a quick glance with his colleague and lowered his voice. "They say some people go up and never come back." Robert laughed, but the waiter continued. "Guards have quit out of nowhere, swearing they saw things inside. Did you know there are maintenance tunnels inside Christ? Some people say that, well, you better ask your guide." Robert returned to the hotel feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, a chill down his spine. Tomorrow, he would find out for himself. Robert woke up early at the hotel, but the previous night still lingered in his mind. The whispers in the bars, the locals' accounts, the uncomfortable feeling that Christ the Redeemer was not just a monument. As he drank coffee, he looked at his photographic equipment, feeling that this job would be different from any other. The advance payment, guaranteed by the American newspaper, made everything stranger. Why so much interest in a simple photo? The clock read 9 a.m. when he met his guide. Miguel was a middle-aged man with a heavy accent and eyes that always seemed to analyze everything around him. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway. I hope you rested well," he said with a polite smile. The tone of his voice, however, sounded distant, as if there was something he didn't want to share. Robert noticed the detail, but didn't comment. The two got in the car towards Corcovado. The winding road was surrounded by dense vegetation, and as they advanced, the morning mist seemed to intensify. The silence in the car was broken by Miguel. Many people come to Christ out of curiosity, but few know what really happened here. Robert looked up, interested. "And what happened?" he asked, adjusting his camera. The guide hesitated for a second before answering. "Deaths. Many deaths." He kept his eyes fixed on the road, as if he didn't want to give more details. But Robert wasn't the type to accept vague answers. The workers, right? I read that many fell during construction. Miguel nodded slowly. Yes, but some bodies were never found. The way he said it sent a shiver down Robert's spine. Upon reaching the top, the view was breathtaking. Christ the Redeemer stood imposingly above the city, shrouded in clouds that made its silhouette even more intimidating. Before climbing the stairs, one of the local employees offered a glass of orange juice to each of them. "Compliments of the house," said the man with a forced smile. Robert accepted, but felt a strange metallic taste when he took the first sip. As he drank, he prepared his camera and began to take the first photos. Miguel, at his side, pointed out architectural details and told the story of the monument. "They say that at night, those who work here hear voices, calls coming from the top of the statue." Robert raised his eyebrow. "Calls?" The guide let out a brief, humorless laugh. "They're just rumors, of course." But there was something in the way he said it that made it clear they weren't just rumors. As they walked through the viewpoint, Robert felt something strange. For a moment, he had the impression that the statue seemed to be looking at him. He blinked, adjusted the focus of the camera, but Christ's gaze remained expressionless, as always. It was just my imagination, he thought, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind made his equipment sway. The noise echoed through the empty viewpoint, and Miguel held his hat. "The weather is changing fast," he said, looking at the sky. Robert bent down to pick up his lens that almost fell to the ground, and at that moment, something caught his attention. Wet footprints on the ground, but no one seemed to have left them there. He looked around, trying to identify where they came from. The marks led to a side door, slightly ajar, which seemed to lead to the interior of the statue. Miguel noticed where Robert was looking and quickly stood in front of him. "This area is not for visitors," he said in a firm, almost authoritarian tone. Robert felt that inside there was the answer to his doubts. The photographer took a deep breath, but knew that insisting now wouldn't help. He let the subject die and continued photographing. But his mind was already taken over by a single certainty. He wouldn't leave there without discovering what was inside Christ, the Redeemer. Robert tried to focus on the job, but his mind was stuck on that ajar door. What exactly was Miguel hiding? The wet footprints were still there, and even if he tried to ignore them, the uncomfortable feeling of being watched grew with each click of his camera. He had photographed monuments all over the world, but had never felt anything like that. Miguel tried to distract him with trivial stories about Christ the Redeemer, but the tone of his voice gave something else away. He was nervous. He looked around frequently and avoided making eye contact. "Let's continue, Mr. Calloway. You've taken enough photos of this area." But Robert didn't give up. He pretended to organize his equipment and, in a quick movement, walked towards the side door. Miguel immediately grabbed his arm. "I told you that this part is not accessible," he said, his voice full of tension. But Robert noticed something strange. Miguel looked inside the door with the same fear that he felt. "If there's nothing wrong, why are you so worried?" Robert provoked, noting that the metal door looked rusty, as if no one had used it for years. Miguel hesitated, pursing his lips. "It's not safe." But before he could react, Robert pushed the door open with force and entered. The air inside Christ the Redeemer was different, heavy. The smell of dust mixed with something metallic, like oxidized iron. The light was scarce, and a strange echo resonated throughout the metallic space. The passages were narrow, with spiral staircases that led to the top of the structure. He turned on his flashlight and noticed scratch marks on the wall. Miguel entered right behind him but didn't advance much. "We shouldn't be here," he whispered. Robert ignored him and continued climbing. With each step, the sound of his footsteps seemed to echo in a distorted way, as if there was something else inside. On the third level, he found something unexpected. Old tools lying on the floor, rusty and covered with thick dust. Among them, a worker's helmet. The problem? It still had a name engraved on it. Manuel Rocha, 1931. Robert felt a chill. Then, a noise. Something moved above them. A dragging sound, slow as if someone was there. Miguel grabbed Robert's arm tightly. "Let's get out of here, now!" But before they could react, the flashlight flickered. For a second, Robert saw something in the reflection of the metal wall. A tall figure, dressed in white, without eyes. Miguel's breathing quickened, and before Robert could turn completely, the door closed on its own with a bang. In the dark, only the sound of shuffling footsteps and a deep breath filled the environment. The darkness inside Christ the Redeemer seemed to come to life. Robert tried to control his breathing, but his chest rose and fell too quickly. The sound of footsteps was still there, slow, shuffling. Something was moving on the floor above. Miguel was pale, his eyes wide. He muttered something in Spanish, almost like a prayer. "We shouldn't have come in. I warned you." But Robert couldn't leave there without answers. He took the flashlight and pointed it at the stairs leading to the next level. The beam of light trembled, and then a shadow crossed the top of the stairs. The photographer froze. Someone was there, but that didn't make sense. Since they entered, they hadn't found anyone. The place should be empty. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the metal walls. Absolute silence. Miguel's panic grew. "That's not a person." He grabbed Robert's arm tightly, but the American pulled his arm back. "If it's not a person, then what is it?" His mind tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was a watchman, another lost tourist, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. They took a few more steps, and then the metal door above opened on its own, creaking as if it had been rusted for years. Robert felt a chill running down his spine. The flashlight flickered, as if electricity was being drained from the environment. That's when they saw it. At the end of the narrow corridor, a tall, thin silhouette emerged from the darkness. The figure was dressed in white, but its face had no eyes. Just a black void, as if space itself had been ripped out of there. He didn't walk, he glided, without making a sound. Miguel let out a stifled scream and began to back away. Robert wanted to run, but something prevented him from moving. The air was heavy, as if it were solid. His feet were glued to the floor. The figure approached, and when it was close enough to touch him, Robert heard his name. "Robert." The sound was distorted, almost metallic, but it was real. That thing knew his name. It was enough to break the trance. Robert pulled Miguel by the arm and ran down the stairs, the sound of their footsteps echoing like hammer blows against the metal. The exit door was closed. They banged, kicked, but it wouldn't budge. Behind them, the corridor filled with shadows. Then, a whisper in Robert's ear. "Why did you come?" At that exact moment, the door opened on its own. They fell out, back into the open air. The midday sun seemed darker, as if the shadow of the statue was chasing them. Miguel knelt on the ground, his face as pale as death. Robert turned back. The door was closed again. No footprints, no sound, nothing. But something was wrong. Robert held his camera tightly. It trembled in his hands. He raised it and looked through the viewfinder. There was a new photo there. A distorted image, captured without him pressing the button. In the photo, the eyeless figure was behind him, and it was smiling. Robert felt his whole body freeze. The photo couldn't be there. He hadn't taken it. He didn't remember even holding the camera at that moment. But the image was there, and that thing was behind him. Miguel stepped away, still trying to catch his breath. "My God, this isn't normal." The guide's voice trembled. Robert tried to find explanations, but none made sense. The photo showed an impossible angle, as if someone had held the camera and captured the exact moment when the thing whispered in his ear. The daylight didn't bring safety. On the contrary, there was something in the shadow of Christ the Redeemer that seemed bigger than before, as if it was watching, absorbing everything that had just happened. "Let's get out of here," Miguel said, pulling Robert by the arm. But the photographer couldn't stop looking at the photo. The blur in the background, the contours of the eyeless face, and worst of all, the smile. There shouldn't be a smile. They walked quickly, but each step seemed forced, as if something invisible was pulling them back. The wind cut in a strange way, carrying whispers that didn't belong to anyone there. A few meters from the exit, Miguel stopped suddenly. "Are you hearing that?" Robert stood still. The whispers were now saying his name. "Robert, Robert." The two looked at each other. The air became dense, as if time itself had slowed down. The sound didn't come from a specific place. It was around them, inside them. The photographer felt something on the back of his neck, an icy touch. He turned abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. Nothing, only Christ, imposing, unattainable. But something seemed different. The eyes of the statue, they seemed deeper, darker, as if they were hiding something or someone. Robert raised the camera, almost reflexively. He needed to record that. He needed proof. He adjusted the focus, held his breath, and pressed the button. Flash. The crack echoed too loudly. Miguel took a step back. "Robert, you weren't supposed to do that." The photographer looked at the viewfinder. The image was loading. 1 second, 2, 3. Then it finally appeared, and Robert screamed. On the screen, he wasn't alone. Behind him, a multitude of pale faces emerged from the base of Christ the Redeemer, sunken eyes, twisted mouths. And at the center of it all was him, the man without eyes. But this time, he wasn't smiling. He was pointing at Robert. Robert's scream echoed through Christ the Redeemer, mixing with the wind that cut through the top of Corcovado Mountain. Miguel tried to pull him away, but the photographer was paralyzed, his eyes glued to the camera screen. This couldn't be real. The photo showed the two of them in front of the statue, but the background, it wasn't the same. The shadows were denser. A cloak of darkness enveloped the place. The sky wasn't blue, it was pitch black. And there, among the distorted outlines, were the faces of the people who had disappeared there. This can't be a mistake," Robert whispered, his throat feeling dry. But Miguel didn't answer. He just stared at the screen. His face was pale, eyes wide. Robert followed his gaze. The image on the camera had changed. Now Robert was no longer in the photo. The photographer took a step back, as if the ground had become unstable. Where was he? His chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing short and erratic. Miguel held his arm tightly. "We need to get out of here, now." They turned, but the way out looked different. The stairs stretched longer. The corridors seemed bigger than before, and the sky above, it wasn't daytime anymore. The sun had disappeared. Robert looked around, desperate. Something was wrong. Time had changed. The place had changed. But Miguel didn't seem to notice. "Robert, hurry up." The guide pulled his arm, but Robert couldn't move anymore. He felt something behind him. He knew something was there. An invisible weight. A gaze fixed on his back. The photographer turned slowly, and he saw. Up there, Christ the Redeemer was no longer the same. The eyes were open, and for the first time he was looking directly at Robert. The camera trembled in his hands. He needed to record this. He needed to prove it. He needed to see. Flash. The sound was deafening. The photo loaded, but Robert didn't have time to see. The wind roared, as strong as thunder, and everything went dark. He was falling. The ground had disappeared beneath his feet. His body plummeted into infinite darkness. The scream got stuck in his throat. And then, silence. The cold wind cut through the top of Corcovado Mountain when Miguel finally opened his eyes. The silence was absolute. Robert was no longer there. The guide spun around, his breathing heavy. Nothing. No sign of the photographer. Just the thick fog that now covered the platform of Christ the Redeemer, like a ghostly cloak. The watch on his wrist seemed frozen in time. The hands weren't moving. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Robert?" His voice came out weak, swallowed by the emptiness. He looked at the camera lying on the ground, the broken screen flickering intermittently. The last photo taken was still there. He hesitated before picking up the device. He needed to see. His fingers trembled as he touched the screen. The image loaded, and the blood drained from his face. Robert was in the photo, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, a tall shadow rose, impossible to distinguish completely. The outline was misshapen, as if it didn't belong to this world. But the eyes were there. Two black holes, empty, devouring the light. Miguel felt his whole body freeze. He didn't want to be there anymore. He ran for the exit, but the path seemed wrong. The stairs that were once familiar now seemed to multiply, spin, close in around him. Each step echoed strangely, as if he were stepping on something hollow, something that was watching him. The guide felt a chill run down his spine when a new voice cut through the silence. Low, hoarse, coming from nowhere. He is now part of us. Miguel spun around. There was no one there. But then, he realized Christ was still watching. And for the first time, he seemed to be smiling. Days passed, and Robert's absence did not go unnoticed. He never returned to the United States. In the office of the newspaper that had hired him for the assignment, in New York, an editor was puzzled by the lack of response. The emails sent to Robert remained unanswered. The phone rang, a tense voice on the other end. It was from the American Embassy in Brazil. The photographer you sent has disappeared. Silence hung in the air. The editor-in-chief swallowed hard. What do you mean, disappeared? Brazilian authorities were conducting a discreet search, trying to avoid panic in the media, but the clues were scarce. No bank transactions, no purchases, nothing. Until on the 10th day of the disappearance, a package arrived at the newspaper. There was no sender, just a brown envelope, worn and crumpled. The editor opened it with trembling hands. Inside, a single thing: a roll of photographic film. The entire newsroom gathered as one of the photographers developed the images. Each click showed a view of Christ the Redeemer. The first ones were common: Robert testing angles, capturing the fog, the details of the structure. But then, the last photo appeared, and no one could breathe. It was Robert, but not as they should see him. He was on the edge of Christ the Redeemer, looking at the camera. His eyes were empty, his face pale, and in the background a figure emerged from the shadow of the statue. Tall, misshapen, with long arms and a white cloak that blended with the fog. The black eyes pierced the lens. Robert's last image was his last photo. The editor-in-chief closed the roll of film in a hurry. This couldn't be real. But then, the lights flickered. The radio in the room made a static noise, and everyone heard, muffled, distorted, a camera click. Robert's case became a mystery within the American Embassy in Brazil. No body, no witnesses, no explanations. But then, a man appeared. Miguel, the guide who accompanied him that day. He arrived at the police station with a pale face and sunken eyes, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. His hands trembled as he held the mug of coffee offered by a policeman. I saw everything. The room fell silent. He told about the tour, about the visit to Christ. He spoke of the strange whispers inside the statue, about the way Robert looked different when he went up to take the last photo. He was looking at me, but it didn't look like him. The chief detective frowned, and then Miguel closed his eyes, trying to contain the memories that had haunted him since that night. He fell, but he didn't scream. He didn't try to hold on. He just fell. The silence weighed on the room. And the camera? One of the investigators asked. Miguel hesitated. The roll of film they found in the newspaper, that last photo. He took a deep breath, and his voice came out trembling. Robert was looking at the camera, but I swear to God, he had already fallen. The room went cold. No one knew what to answer. And then, as if it were a last warning, the lights in the police station flickered. For a second, a crackle echoed on the radio. Something metallic, familiar. The sound of a camera shutter, and Miguel felt someone was taking his picture. Time passed, but Robert's disappearance was never solved. The case was closed. Another foreigner missing in Brazil. The camera was sent back to the United States, along with the original roll of film. But out of fear or superstition, no one ever opened that envelope again. The newspaper closed the case. The story was never published. Robert's files were deleted from the records. But something remained. In the darkness of the internal tunnels of Christ the Redeemer, night guards began to report noises. Sounds of footsteps, the click of a camera echoing in the metal corridors. A new security guard, curious, went in to investigate. His radio crackled as he advanced through the narrow corridors. He stopped in front of one of the metal panels, where some tools were lying on the floor. His reflection was there. But then, the radio went silent, and the reflection blinked. His eyes widened. He hadn't blinked. The guard stepped back. Cold sweat ran down his neck. And then, from some dark point in the tunnel, came a hoarse whisper. "Tell the newspaper that the last photo was perfect." He ran. He quit his job that night and never came back. But they say that sometimes when Christ the Redeemer is covered in fog, if you look closely at the top, you can see a shadow there, standing, holding something in his hands, as if waiting for the next photo. Robert's case remains an unanswered mystery. No witnesses, no logical explanation, just a lost camera and a last photo that shouldn't exist. The story was never a headline, but Christ the Redeemer holds secrets that not everyone knows. If one day you visit Rio de Janeiro and climb to the top of the mountain, if you feel a cold wind, even in the heat of summer, hear a metallic crack, like a distant click, don't look back, because maybe it's your last photo too. If you enjoyed this chilling story, leave your comment below. Do you believe that places can hold dark memories? Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this before your photo is taken too.